Boy, I am digging myself a hole with this one, aren't I? Okay, I know what you're all thinking. You probably saw the title and immediately thought, I'm some sort of hater, you're probably gonna leave a dislike and not even listen to what I have to say, but if you've even listened this far into the video, please just hear me out. Because here's the thing, this is not a hit piece on Astrobot. As a matter of fact, if you came into this video thinking based on the title that I hate Astrobot, you're mistaken. I quite like Astrobot. It's a really fun game. It has fluid and intuitive controls. The jump laser being one of your primary means of attack is actually quite ingenious design. It's got a bunch of really creative and fun gameplay ideas that naturally expand the scope of the gameplay without changing it on a fundamental level, mostly. It's simple but has an incredible difficulty curve, meaning the final challenge level will kick your ass into submission. It's visually stunning in a lot of instances, really taking advantage of its hardware, and it's also in some ways exactly what games should be aiming to be. A well-made 10 to 12 hour game made by a small team of talented people that doesn't cost infinity billion dollars to make, so it can sell a relatively high amount of units but not have to sell an additional infinity billion units to turn a profit. That's what the industry should be aiming for, instead of spending $500 million on a game nobody fucking asked for. Thinking of you, Concord, for the first and only time in my life. And in that respect, I appreciate Astrobot for showing the rest of the industry how it's done. However, I think the level of praise that it received is somewhat undeserved, at least from my perspective. Does it deserve praise? Absolutely. But it comes across like the game was championed as a second coming of Jesus to some degree, and in comparison to all the praise, I couldn't help but feel underwhelmed. I feel like the basis of why I believe Astrobot didn't deserve the praise it got comes down to this. I've long since thought the entire platformer genre these days is stuck in a perpetual state of emotional arrested development, because most developers in said genre have no ambition other than putting you into a nostalgic comfort zone by reminding you of other games that you've already played, and for the people who like that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing those people like. But with that said, I think Astrobot might just be the most guilty example of this I've ever seen, where it's a game that will prioritize nostalgic imagery and reminding you of other games above anything else, to the point where the game's own ideas and imagery suffers. I played the game for 12 hours, I platinumed it, and yet from the start of the game to the end of the game, there's not a single thing in the actual game that I remember about it. Not a single moment that sticks out in my memory above the rest. It might have the least personality of any game I've ever played, or at least of any game I've played in recent years. And why is that? Well, to be honest, it's because the only identity that this game has is, hey, remember this? Because the qualifier from a few sentences ago was in the actual game. I do remember a few moments in the game, but none of them had to do with anything about the game itself. You see, one of the primary aspects of this game is going around saving various bots in various levels. Many of these bots are based on pre-existing properties, and once you unlock one of their defining items from the item shop, they will be in the overworld doing some sort of iconic pose or action relevant to their game, and that is something I distinctly remember. I remember hitting Jackbot, having him fall dead, and them doing a parody of the death scene from the first Jak and Daxter. That got an audible laugh out of me. I remember finding Crash Bandicoot Bot and doing a dance with him. I remember hitting Dartfeld Bot and being distinctly disappointed that all it did was show a damage counter. Seriously, you couldn't even have him do one of his additions? These are the only things that stick out in my memory when I look back on this game, an entire series of references to other properties. Fun Easter eggs where the enjoyment of it entirely depends on your knowledge of other historical game franchises, and to be quite frank, I feel like they recognized this as being the case considering they positioned rescuing these robots as the primary goal in the game. Does the game have any defining personality other than that? Yes, but it's entirely generic. The main villain is a green alien monster, the ship you fly around is literally a PS5, with the major goal of the game being to repair said PS5. All the level theming is relatively creative, but nothing you haven't seen before. Jungles, cities, casinos, gothic castles, etc. As for the bosses, the only one I can think of off the top of my head other than the final boss would be that gorilla boss, but only because you have to defeat it by breaking its teeth, and that's the type of thing I have nightmares about. But when I think back to the game, none of the bosses really strike me as anything more than insert boss fight here type bosses. And that's really just the entire Astrobot theming part of the game in a nutshell for me. It's just an insert game here type of thing used to bridge the gap between the things you're actually here for. Everything that's memorable about Astrobot to me is something taken from an entirely different game. Hell, in each of the main 5 worlds, there's even a level that's entirely based off an existing property where you play as bot versions of those characters. Namely a Horizon level, a God of War level, an Ape Escape level, an Uncharted level, and a Loco Roco level? The hell? Apparently each of these levels are supposed to represent a big property from each of the previous PlayStation consoles except for the Vita, so no Gravity Rush level. Though they muddy the issue by making it the Norse version of God of War instead of the Greek version, even though God of War is supposed to be representing the PS2. Was that a mandate by Sony? Or is that because 2018 and Ragnarok outsold the entire rest of the series 2-1? No idea, either way it's very disrespectful. But these levels really just say it all to me. The main Astrobot character gets an iconic item from that game and literally becomes the main character. Or at least a stand-in for them. I remember before I played this game, a friend of mine was talking to me about it, and one of the first things he told me was, there's a level that's literally just Ape Escape, and he's not wrong. Sadly, much like how the most memorable aspects of the game are cameos, these are the most memorable individual levels in the game because they're allowed to have more defining features based around the property they're based on. Like how in the God of War themed level, there's a parody of that mural from God of War 2018 that depicts Kratos' death, and that's actually really funny. Plus, they also shift the gameplay a bit in order to make these levels more akin to the games in question. Not wildly so, except for the Loco Roco level, which genuinely feels like a completely different game. It's still very much a platformer in these levels with their own twist. But the whole thing feels a bit pandering, if I want to be charitable, masturbatory if I didn't. Not to the same degree, of course, because I still like this game, but it does kind of feel like it's on the same spectrum as a lot of those nostalgia bait movies Hollywood is churning out at a record pace, where they try to distract you with things you recognize, and that's confusing to me because I feel like this is a game that's good enough to where it didn't necessarily need that sort of thing. Sure, the Astrobot game that came prepackaged with the PS5 had a lot of this, but they didn't necessarily need to make that the series' identity. It could have just done its own thing if they tried a bit harder to make it have its own unique identity and personality, because Astrobot himself actually has a really instantly iconic design. The polished white exterior with blue eyes, the unique design that can only be described as French-shaped. There's something there, but I guess then the argument would be that the reason why so many people bought the game was for the novelty of seeing all these recognizable IPs represented. So it might have been a bit of a catch-22, and now that the series is defined by this sort of thing, that might be an identity they have difficulty shaking off, if they want to shake it off. And that's a shame because I remember generally enjoying the experience overall, but never once in the entire game did I stand up and think, that's a defining moment right there. It was just a general sense of, okay, that was pretty good, all the way through. And even if I do remember certain things as far as the gameplay is concerned, a lot of it is just a feeling more so than individual moments. I remember the final level kicking my ass, but I can't remember any individual moments from that level. And you know what? I'm sure there are a lot of people at this point asking about why that even matters if the game is fun. Well, I guess in theory it doesn't necessarily matter as long as the game is good. Different people want different things out of games, and for some, this is enough. But for me, what it kind of comes down to is the different levels of praise. This is a game that won so many Game of the Year awards, and when I saw that, I couldn't help but think, really? This is the best that 2024 has to offer? I think back to my favorite games of all time, and consider what it was that made them my favorite games. Let me take, for example, Infamous 2. This is a game that's pretty much sublime in every aspect. The gameplay in particular is some of the best superhero sandbox gameplay on the market. Or off the market, given that the game's not being sold anymore. It's fluid, it's explosive, it's hard-hitting, it's several other buzzwords. It's an incredibly fun game at a base level, but the fact is, as fun as the game is by itself, that's not the reason why it's one of my favorite games of all time. If you were to completely eliminate the story altogether, or make it a terrible story, well, suddenly it's not one of my favorite games of all time anymore, as I gaze in the direction of Infamous Second Son. Because what makes it truly memorable to me, what makes it stick in my head so much, are the moments between gameplay. Those are the defining moments to me. The heartbreaking dramatic elements, seeing Cole wrestle with the idea of whether or not he's good enough to save the world, that subplot that becomes the main plot with the plague that threatens to wipe out humanity, Zeke's entire character arc, the sudden shift of the Beast being the bad guy to suddenly being arguably the misunderstood good guy, these are the things that make the gameplay significant. It's not just shooting bad guys in the face with lightning because I want to, it's shooting bad guys in the face with lightning because it matters. Let's take another one of my favorite games of all time, Saints Row 2. There are very few times in life where throwing yourself into traffic is more enjoyable than this, and yet when you ask anybody who's played the game about it, what's the first thing that most of them will bring up? What's the defining moment of the experience? Well, it's the moment where you have to put Carlos out of his misery after he was chained to a trailer hitch and dragged across the asphalt for miles. It's this beautifully poignant scene where, without dialogue, we see the boss realize that despite saving Carlos, whatever's left of him will never live a normal life again, and even if he does, he's gonna be living in pain and suffering for years to come before he even has a chance at living pain-free. So it's more merciful to put him out of his misery right now. It's a completely dialogue-free scene that conveys so much and ends in tragedy. That's a game where it's not about the fact that you're throwing yourself into traffic, it's about the fact that they make you care why you're doing it. And that's the intangible element that elevates the experience. It's a game that combines a unique, compelling world and story with sublime gameplay, and the result is something that's equal parts chaotic, dramatic, and plain fun. In fact, I'm going to bring up an example of a series of games that I think survive entirely off their personality. I've made it a joke to never even acknowledge this series, but just this once, Sly Cooper. I'm gonna say something extremely controversial. Outside of the first game, Sly Cooper does not have good gameplay. Like, at all. It has unique gameplay, but most of the actual challenge of the game is taken away because it's very automated. You jump and press the circle button, and the game plays it for you. If you're older than 5, that's not good gameplay, and the only reason why the first game manages to make the gameplay work is because they balance the relative lack of difficulty by making you die in one hit. But as far as gameplay is concerned, I would hazard to guess that 95% of the games in that particular genre have better, more challenging gameplay than jumping and pressing the circle button. So why is it that the series is still beloved to this day? Because you don't come to the series for gameplay. If you think you do, you don't. That's a means to an end. You come to it because of the characters, because of the personality, because of the unique presentation. It's an entire series that's better than the sum of its parts, but it can't survive once you take a single aspect of the experience away. Because no one aspect of the experience is so good on its own to carry the game, but because of its unique blend of attributes, it stands out despite its shortcomings to the point where you may not even realize the shortcomings exist. You don't even need a game that fades to cutscene every 5 seconds to illustrate my point. Breath of the Wild is an example of a game that I think deserved every bit of praise it got. That's a game where the story elements were spread out and not the most in-depth, but the world itself is so textured and has so many emergent aspects and things to discover that the game gains a degree of personality just through how the world is built, just through having a coherent and vibrant world. The same would apply to something like Dark Souls, where there's very little deliberate story, and a lot of it is emergent and interpretive. Yet it sticks with you so vividly because of the way the game is presented, so while it's something that you remember for its groundbreaking combat engine, it's also something you remember for just how textured and deep the world is. But it's also worth mentioning that there are games I like where I don't consider them to have any defining aspect within the story, but the gameplay itself is groundbreaking and compelling enough that it can define the experience. The Just Cause games, Red Faction, Guerrilla, and I feel like that says to me that gameplay in itself can be a defining aspect. It can be what pushes the game to the next level, but only if it's something that no other game is doing. And let's just call a spade here, it's no secret that as good as the gameplay is in this game, it is extremely reminiscent of Mario Galaxy. This is arguably the biggest knock that people had against the game, the idea that the gameplay was adapted from a different game, but whether it's a ripoff or inspired by other games, I don't necessarily think that's a flaw. Because I believe that as long as you're creative enough, there's nothing wrong with taking ideas from formulas that have been established as something that work. And this is a game that does expand on those ideas. But the fact that it does take heavy inspiration from other games does mean that for me, the gameplay can't possibly be the thing that pushes the game to the next level in the same way as something like Red Faction Guerrilla, because it isn't doing anything new. Solid as it is, it's just missing a few of those key elements that really push it to that next level. In fact, there's a game that is very comparable to Astrobot that addresses every single one of my criticisms. It's a game that's very reminiscent of many other games and yet has so much personality and so many defining moments that it's practically bursting at the seams with them. A little game from 2017 called A Hat in Time. At a base level, the gameplay is very reminiscent of games like Mario Sunshine or Jak and Daxter. Things that were a dime a dozen back in the day, and yet this one takes that germ of an idea and makes an incredible experience out of it by having so many unique ideas to the point where you're never quite sure what it's gonna do next. There is so much creativity on display. One level, it's an average platformer, and then in the next, you may need to solve a murder mystery with a bunch of owls. Then you might have a level where you're part of a parade. There's an entire survival horror level out of nowhere. There's a level where you sell your soul and have to take it back, and it's all punctuated by an incredibly dark sense of humor in the internal narration. It's an incredibly unsuspecting game, and yet it's one of my favorite games in the genre because it's not just a good game. It's a good game that uses its good gameplay as a basis to explore so many unique ideas and themes. I feel like that's an example of this sort of thing done right. I've long since wanted to make a video about A Hat in Time, particularly how I think it's a game that puts all nostalgia bait 3D platformers to shame, but that's a topic for another day. Either way, I see the praise that Astrobot got, and I think of something like A Hat in Time and why I feel they do pretty much the same thing, and yet one does it so much better in my eyes. To the point that it transcends the concept of nostalgia bait. Astrobot, not so much. Its theming is some of the least creative theming I've seen, and it's one of the least emotionally resonant games I've played. And quite frankly, for how good it is, it's one of the least memorable games I've ever played. And make no mistake, it is nostalgia bait. Well-made nostalgia bait, but nostalgia bait nonetheless. Maybe that's enough for you, and that's valid, but for me, I believe that games can and should be so much more than that, or at least they should be more than that to earn the level of praise that Astrobot received. And it makes me question what exactly the X factor was that made this game so heavily well received, because is it fair to say that there was a novelty to it on account of the fact that it was essentially a Nintendo-style platformer made by Sony? Well, maybe, but that's not necessarily for me to decide. Either way, I say this without a hint of hyperbole whatsoever. If Astrobot had an identity beyond, hey, remember this? If it had some defining element to it beyond reminding you of other things, if it had personality beyond the personality that it borrows from other franchises, if the actual Astrobot part of the game wasn't the most generic thing possible, it might have actually been one of the greatest games ever made. It's just that good, and that's why I get worked up over the idea that it doesn't, because I could see what this game and what this property could have been, but it torpedoed those very elements that could have pushed it to the next level for someone like me. I guess we'll see how things go in the future, given that the game was an unexpected hit. We might be able to expect a sequel or two, but then again, maybe not. Guess we'll just have to wait and see. Either way, if you take anything from this video, let it be this. I don't hate Astrobot, not one bit, but I believe it could have been better. That's all I've got, so I'll say what I always say. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Ga004, Hydra Overlord, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Sphinx, Weird Webster, and Will Stokes for going above and beyond. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.